Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Louis-Philippe Champagne. I'm the Associate Vice President for Public Affairs and Industry Practices at the Canadian Construction Association. I'm proud to welcome you today to our Construction Quarterly Insight Economic Report briefing for summer 2026. Many of you have been on these briefings before. You'll be familiar with the format. We will begin with a presentation of the report, as well as the key findings and data set that are presented in the document. This will be conducted by my colleague, Max Aliou, who's CCA's economic analyst and the author of the report. After that presentation, we will switch to a short Q&A session toward the end, so you can ask specific questions regarding the report, the overall economic state of construction, and the work CCA do as an advocacy group on your behalf. I'll let Max go into great detail about the information of the report, but I do want to highlight that more than a year has passed since the trade tension and tariff dispute became a defining feature of North American business environment. For Canada, the Canadian construction industry, these developments are influencing investment decision, material cost, procurement practices, and compliance burden. Today's presentation examines how the economy and construction sector are performing against this backdrop and looks at the practical consequences of a more fragmented trading environment. Without further ado, I'll turn the mic to my colleague Max, who's going to run you through the report, and I'll be back in a few minutes with the Q&As. Have a great briefing.
So, hello everyone, let me just share my screen. Welcome to the summer 2026 edition of our Economic Insight. We will start with an overview of the state of the Canadian economy and the construction industry. The technical recession made headlines in the second quarter of 2026 and sparked fierce debate. Real GDP slipped by an annualized rate of 0.1%. While the margin is small, the reading fell short of expectations. Component-wise, the decline was driven largely by a wider trade deficit. Imports increased by 3%, attributable to a combination of higher imports of passenger cars, light trucks, and industrial machinery. Exports were essentially unchanged, despite higher exports of oil and bitumen, supported by the rising prices. These gains were offset by lower exports of passenger cars and light trucks. This appears less a story of weaker US demand rather than the production stoppages and factory retooling. Household consumption continued to grow, but no longer signaling strong consumer demand. Spending increased in financial services and food rather than in more discretionary categories, such as travel abroad or new vehicle purchases. Inventories recovered after being depleted in the last quarter of 2025. The increase was driven by manufacturers rebuilding their stockpiles, while retail and wholesale inventories continued to decline. Investment was the real surprise in Q1 GDP. Government investment in weapon systems fell by 24%, as seen in the red line on the chart. Even so, spending remained approximately 4 times higher than its average in the past decade. Investment is expected to stay elevated as Canada advances major defense procurements, such as submarines, and move towards its NATO 3.5% commitment. Investment in structures also weakened. Both residential and non-residential investment in structures declined by just over 2%. The softness in residential investment was largely attributable to lower resale activity, which is captured as ownership transfer costs, while investment on new residential construction demand remained stable. The larger drag came from engineering structures. There is very little nuanced public information on the source of that, but the number lines up with the oil and gas capital spending, which fell 13% in the first quarter. This is far more than earlier annual guidance had implied and will likely recover in the rest of 2026. On the inflation front, as we discussed 3 months ago, the Bank of Canada was unlikely to change course unless the energy shock persisted long enough to spill over into broader price pressures. So far, inflation remains largely concentrated in energy and adjacent categories. Headline inflation was 2.8% in June, but inflation excluding gasoline remained close to 2%. Against this backdrop, the bank has continued to hold this policy rate at 2.25%. The consensus rate path has also changed very little. Rates are expected to remain steady into early 2027. The loonie weakened as the US and Canadian interest rate expectation diverged again. In the US, inflation is elevated and labor market has remained broadly stable. This gave the Federal Reserve more room to prioritize price stability rather than support employment. The Fed's medium projected policy rate for Q4 of 2026 is now about 0.4 percentage point higher than where it was a quarter ago. As a result, US bond yields or prospective returns on US Treasury bills rose while Canadian yields changed little. The spread widened between US and Canadian short-term Treasury yield shown on the left of the slide. Higher spread increased the demand for the greenback relative to the loonie. As the chart on the right shows, the USD CAD exchange rate rose above 1.42, putting the Canadian dollar at its weakest level since 2025. Oil prices have also moved more closely with the US dollar, limiting the typical support that higher crude prices provide to the Canadian dollar. In terms of macro outlook, we can see from this chart that the Bank of Canada's July projections are modestly more pessimistic than its April projections. For 2026, projected real GDP growth was revised down, while inflation was revised up. In other words, the bank now expects softer growth alongside somewhat higher inflation. The 2027 growth forecast looks stronger, but the level of real GDP is still below previous projections because the economy will start 2027 from a lower base. Everything shown on the past two slides were considered better than feared. The caveat is that these projections were made under more optimistic assumptions of energy prices. They assumed that Brent would average about $75 per barrel in the third quarter of 2026 and gradually decline to around $70 by the end of 2027. Current prices are already well above that assumed path, and this means additional upside risk for inflation and downside risk for growth. Back in June, Brent was trading around $90 a barrel. Israel was still striking Lebanon even after US-Iran ceasefire has begun. So back then I wrote down that power dynamics in the Gulf have shifted materially and geopolitical risk may not disappear anytime soon. About 2 weeks later, the MOU was signed. Brent subsequently fell below $75. Then I wrote, oil prices fell sharply, supporting normalization of the inflation path. And as I was preparing the slide around the World Cup final, while President Trump was having a great time on the podium, Brent climbed back towards $90 a barrel. I checked again this morning, it was sitting at around $80 a barrel. Crude oil and refined fuel prices are likely to remain above their pre-war levels. And as we said 3 months ago, what truly matters is not the increase in gas prices now, but how long it takes for traffic through the strait to normalize. If the disruption continues beyond August, the consequences could be much more serious. And here is just a chart showing you that crude exports through the strait since March has remained lower than before. At the top, the first bar represents the last month of July. Exports averaged even lower than back in April. June had some relief during the ceasefires, but that was still nowhere near the normal pre-war traffic levels. Zooming in on construction activity and the building permit pipeline, construction was the largest drag on GDP by industry in the first quarter. Sector GDP contracted by 1.3% from the last quarter of 2025, the second consecutive drop. In comparison, the all industry actually sustained around the same level. The swing factor here was engineering and other construction activities, which declined by 4%. The slowdown was visible across provinces and subtrades. In addition to the pause in oil and gas capital expenditures discussed earlier, declines were recorded in highway, street, and bridge construction according to payroll data. Higher oil prices caused the current shortage isn't sustaining enough to incentivize major long-term investment in production capacity. While engineering and other construction activities remain 1% higher year over year, GDP from residential building construction is 2% lower. In terms of building investment or estimated amount of work put in place, StatCan revised its 2025 estimates down. So the correction was concentrated in residential buildings, which was revised down by almost 5% on average. The agency cited factors including delayed construction start dates. In the first quarter of 2026, Canada recorded $63 billion in building construction investment, up 1.6% from the previous quarter. So this reverses the 1.5% quarterly decline that was initially reported in the original data to what is the positive increase shown in this presentation. The revised estimates for 2025 created a weaker base of comparison. Residential construction no longer appear to have driven the quarterly contraction, although activity remained subdued and the Q1 estimates weren't revised higher compared to before the revisions. The pause in rate cuts offered little relief, while uncertainty around new home rebates, which was not finalized until March, gave buyers another reason to wait. Among provinces, Quebec's multi-residential and Alberta's single residential sectors were the weakest areas, while Manitoba and Saskatchewan's residential sectors outperformed. Industrial investment remained weak, sitting 15% below where it was a year earlier, while ICI gains were most substantial in Alberta and BC. Permits maintained the recovery at the end of 2025. Intentions improved in parts of residential and industrial construction, where recent activity had weakened. The non-residential categories that cushioned investment softened. Result varied considerably across subsectors and provinces. The standout was industrial permits, colored in the light gray, where most provinces recorded industrial gains, except Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. The increase was concentrated in BC, where value nearly tripled after the approval of Metro Vancouver's North Shore wastewater treatment plant. Industrial gains were offset by decreases in commercial permits. Atlantic provinces saw a combined increase of more than 40%, but while intentions declined across the board in the rest of Canada, especially in Ontario and Alberta. Institutional permits slipped, although they remain higher than a year earlier. The decreases were driven primarily by the Atlantic region and BC. Ontario moved in the opposite direction, supported by the approval of UHN's $800 million surgical tower at Toronto Western Hospital. Gains in single residential intentions were broad, the first quarterly increase since the start of 2021. Multi-residential permits are still subdued. The two notable provincial changes were in Ontario, where apartment permits recovered, and in Alberta, where they fell by almost 30% to a 2-year low, driven by softer rental construction in Calgary. Provincially, Alberta and Atlantic provinces decreased the most in terms of building permits, while Ontario and Quebec recovered. The theme for this quarter is around tariffs, negotiations, and remedies. Engagement with Washington intensified through the second quarter of 2026. Federal and provincial officials increased their presence in Washington, D.C., while informal meetings between Canadian and U.S. stakeholders became more frequent. More recently, the White House's new Section 338 tariffs have added further urgency to bilateral discussions. Trade is top of mind for all Canadian businesses. Canada has largely maintained its tariff position since the end of 2025, while the U.S. tariff regime has continued to evolve, following the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA ruling. To recap, on February 20th, the US Supreme Court ruled that the tariffs imposed under the IEEPA are unlawful. The White House responded by implementing a global 10% tariff regime under Section 122. The chart on the right shows how the change in legal instrument changed the effective US tariff rate on the world. The Supreme Court ruling removed about half of the total tariffs, around 7%, while the administration recovered half of what's lost, the 3.3 percentage point of tariff rate that's represented in green in the third bar, by introducing the 10% Section 122 tariffs. Section 122, similar to IEEPA, exempt imports from Canada if they are CUSMA compliant. So this mainly mattered to the US and the rest of the world, not Canada or Mexico. The US wanted stricter North American content rules, more screening on foreign direct investment, and heightened scrutiny of origin claims. Beside these economic security objectives, on March 31st, the USTR submitted its 2026 national trade estimates to the President and Congress. For Canada, the report provided a formal catalog of Washington's trade irritants ahead of negotiations. The report extends beyond tariffs, covering import policies, technical barriers, customs administrations, and other areas. Steel, aluminum, and autos remain the central issues for all three CUSMA partners. Some of these concerns have already moved from negotiation ledger to tariff action. On July 20th, the White House issued 3 separate Section 338 actions concerning motor vehicles, Canada's supply management system of dairy, and removal of US alcohol from provincial liquor board distribution channels. Washington is also pressing Canada on government procurement, including the federal Buy Canadian policy, US business access to provincial procurement, namely in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, and the proposed Sovereign Cloud Initiative. Before we move on to last week's developments, let's look at how trade tensions so far have already affected Canada's international trade. So Canada ran a sizable trade deficit for much of 2025, where its bilateral trade surplus with the US narrowed. Since March 2026, however, Canada has returned to a trade surplus. Driven primarily by stronger exports of crude oil, bitumen, unwrought gold, and gold alloys, higher prices raised the value of oil and bitumen exports, while the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion provided additional capacity. Gold exports were similarly supported by higher prices and chunky bullion shipments. Export losses remain concentrated in sectors directly exposed to US tariffs. Some tariffed industries have proved more resilient than initially feared. Aluminum is the clearest example. Canadian exports recovered because the industry remains structurally competitive in the US market. US supply shortages pushed aluminum prices higher, while US domestic and alternative foreign capacity could not replace the Canadian supply at scale. Copper also sidestepped some losses by shifting exports away from the downstream copper derivative products towards upstream feedstock that remain outside of the tariff parameters. Other tariff sectors remain deeply strained. Steel is still the clearest casualty. Auto, wood, and wood derivative products continue to suffer as well. By May 2026, both Canadian exports to and imports from the US had rebounded to their pre-trade war levels. However, most of that is accounted by higher crude oil prices. The US's share of Canadian total merchandise trade is around 5 percentage points lower below its 2024 average. Canada gained trade with other markets at the margin while remaining deeply integrated with the US. Do note on these charts that the US series, which is colored in blue, are plotted against the right-hand axis, whereas the other lines are plotted against the left-hand side. So on the export side, most of the incremental growth went to Europe, but the diversification was narrower than headline numbers suggest. Much of the increase came from unwrought gold, silver, platinum alloys, rather than the result of diversified manufacturing exports. The rebound in US imports was concentrated in motor vehicles, chemical, plastic, and rubber products, particularly diluent used in oil sand production. It does not indicate a broad normalization of Canadian demand for US goods either. Compositionally, changes reflect tariff-driven supply chain reconfiguration within the automakers' existing production networks, rather than a wholesale shift in Canada's sourcing relationship. US auto plants are increasingly reserved for the US market, while Canada is being supplied from tariff-exempt plants in Mexico, Japan, and South Korea. So typically, Canadian export and the US tariffs are not the most relevant topics for a construction audience. Focusing on them can be misleading when assessing the impact on importers. However, this export-oriented perspective is central to the negotiations that will develop very quickly in the coming weeks. It is also especially timely in light of the recently imposed Section 338 tariffs of 50% on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods. The proclamation was sudden, directed exclusively at Canada, and consistent with President Trump's previous negotiating tactics. He sets a penalty in motion, lights the statutory 30-day fuse, and then negotiates with the tariff scheduled to take effect unless a deal is reached. We will likely see considerable movement in August, with the final tariff regime potentially looking quite different from the one that's already signed. This slide shows where the new Section 338 tariffs would land if they were to take effect, as is on August 19th. The measure covers roughly 5% of Canada's exports to the US. And like the Section 232 tariffs, it applies to even CUSMA compliant goods. However, products already subject to the Section 232 tariffs are excluded, so the duties do not stack. The exposure is highly concentrated. Chemicals and plastic, along with electronics, electrical equipment, account for almost half of the affected trade. So on the map, the percentages show the share of each province's US-bound exports that would be affected. BC faces the highest exposure at 13.7%, followed by Quebec at 11% and Ontario at 9%. On average, this would increase Canada's effective tariff rate by 2 percentage points to around 7%. Now that may seem modest in the aggregate, but to the narrow trade base that's targeted, a 50% tariff is prohibitive. It can effectively close the US market, and for the most exposed firms, they face ceasing operations altogether. This slide shows how Canada's CUSMA shield has been gradually punctured. At the beginning of 2025, 97% of Canadian goods enter the US could still be protected through CUSMA compliance. Over the following month, successive Section 232 measures carved out steel, aluminum, copper, automobiles, lumber one by one. By October 2025, the share that CUSMA could still shield had fallen to about 86%. This April, the metal regime change recast the treatment of steel and aluminum. I'll spare you the details, but overall, despite also accounting for the new medium and heavy duty vehicle tariffs that was introduced last November, these changes reduced the goods tariffed by Section 232 from roughly $50 billion to $42 billion. However, the partial relief would be more than offset if Section 338 takes effect in August as is. The result is the final bar, where the CUSMA shield would lose another 3 percentage points of coverage, falling to 82%. Section 338 was not the end of the tariff developments in July. The same week, USTR finalized the forced labor tariffs under Section 301. effectively passing the statutory baton from Section 122, leaving no gaps in between. The headline rate for Canada is a blanket 10%, but Canada's practical exposure is very limited. First, Canadian products entering the US under CUSMA are exempt from this action. Second, the tariffs, again, does not stack with the existing 232 tariffs. All products already covered by the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, vehicles, and lumber are carved out from this measure. Therefore, the Section 301 tariffs is largely a new burden for other countries outside of North America. To close the tariff section, this chart puts the news headlines into perspective by comparing Canada's US effective tariff rate to the world using estimates from Yale's Budget Lab. The top line shows the global average tariff rate on all goods entering the US. It is based on rates legally imposed, weighted by the import shares in 2024, rather than duties that's actually collected. The world average rose to more than 20% following the Liberation Day announcement. The US-China Geneva Truce then reversed the most extreme part of that escalation, while the Supreme Court later struck down the broad IEEPA tariffs. So the global average rate is currently at about 11%, roughly half of its Liberation Day level. Canada's story has been more favorable. However, its advantage has been shrinking. If the proposed Section 338 tariff proceed, Canada's rate would rise, and the gap with the world would shrink from roughly 6 percentage points now to 3.5 percentage points. So although Canada has not introduced new broad tariffs in 2026 so far, there are other trade remedies, and they are highly relevant to construction. The Buy Canadian policy are moving forward with the scheduled changes and additional details. On June 1st, PSPC released the Canadian Materials Compliance Framework, formalizing how existing obligations will be monitored and enforced while they continue to operationalize the framework. For contractors, the main evidence requirements include self-attestations, proof of origin records, and chain of custody documentations. On June 15th, the Canadian supplier and Canadian content policy threshold dropped from $25 million to $5 million for competitive strategic procurements. The transition period for existing in-scope supply arrangements will conclude on July 14, requiring continuing essays to include reciprocal procurement clauses in their renewal or amendments. The expected shift in eligibility from supplier location to goods and services origin still has no date. While international trade is primarily a federal matter, the tariff responses has opened door to local protectionism as well. Many provinces has moved to restrict US contractors from public procurement. A few others have gone further by favoring provincial rather than merely Canadian suppliers. Ontario is the clearest example. Bill 72, the Buy Ontario Act, was introduced in November 2025. In less than 3 weeks, the bill passed the legislature with broad support. As of June 1st, all Buy Ontario directive requirements had taken effect across the covered public sector entities with no set expiry date. The timing is awkward. Provinces are promising to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, yet Buy Ontario moves in the opposite direction. Ontario's provisions apply to only Ontario owners, but they carry implications for contractors across Canada who wants to bid in Ontario projects. Buy Ontario is both a procurement and a funding requirement. Ontario may withhold funding if municipal or designated broader public sector entities or BPS entities fails to comply. The Act brings together two existing measures and adds two strategic categories. The first existing measure is the Building Ontario Business Initiative, introduced in 2022, which created a preference for Ontario businesses. The second is the procurement restriction policy launched in 2025 in response to trade tensions with the US, which limited participation of US businesses. The two strategic categories are fleet vehicles and capital infrastructure. The two existing measures cover provincial government entities, including ministries, provincial agencies, Ontario Power Generation, and Independent Electricity System Operator, as well as designated BPS entities such as hospitals, school boards, universities, and colleges. The two additional strategic categories applies to both provincial and municipal entities, extending scope to municipalities, local boards, and municipal services corporations. How does this affect procurement? For the construction sector, the key change is that Buy Ontario replaces the old BOBI framework with a dedicated capital infrastructure stream. This stream introduced two important changes to new procurements. First, it expands the scope by bringing municipal into the framework. Second, where the old BOBI framework gave Ontario bidders an edge over out-of-province bidders, the infrastructure rule now rewards vendor with the highest Ontario content regardless of where the business is based. Vendors are required to submit a domestic supply chain plan using one of two approaches, the commitment approach or the evaluated approach. Under the commitment approach, vendors must meet a minimum domestic content threshold. The directive sets no numerical floor, so owners could theoretically set the threshold at 5%, allowing almost every bid to qualify, then evaluate the bids as usual. Under the evaluated approach, the rules depend on whether the procurement falls below or above the Canadian Free Trade Agreement thresholds. Below the thresholds, a 10% evaluation advantage is given to the vendor with the highest Ontario content. At or above the threshold, a 10% advantage is given to the vendor with the highest domestic content, with Ontario content weighted twice and other Canadian content weighted once. You can see the formulas visualized in the bottom right figure. For larger procurements, owner may select a lower ranked vendor if its DSPC score is at least 50% higher than the top ranked vendor, provided that neither its bid price nor construction schedule is more than 10% greater. There are some exclusions. OPG and IESO remain subject to the BOBI rules. For other entities, exclusions are considered on a case-by-case basis and require approval by Deputy Minister, CEO, or equivalent authority. Approval may be granted only where a detailed market assessment indicates that applying the requirement would increase the project cost by 25% or more. Overall, the policy shifts procurement from a simple business location test towards project-level proof of domestic content. And for contractors, that means more upfront planning, origin documentation, and administrative burden. These requirements are likely to remain as governments place greater emphasis on economic nationalism. The added complexity would narrow supplier options, weaken competition, extend procurement timelines, and increase project costs. Moving on to labor markets. I see that we only have about 15 minutes, or 10 minutes. I will kind of skip through the labor sections. They're less interesting than other areas that we've covered so far. But namely, if we look at this chart, you will see that payroll employees have stayed close to where they were in the last quarter of 2025. Most of the gains happened in Quebec, but whereas if we look at all employees, so including both payrolled and self-employed employed workers, then you will see that Quebec actually recorded the largest decrease. The story here is that Quebec drove most of the national decline in total employment, but its share of payroll workforce actually increased. Even before the recent changes in 2026, Quebec had 77% of its labor force being on payrolls out of the total, compared to what's 72% in the national average. And the recent divergence has pushed it to 82% in March. So there's a increase in the share of payroll employees in Quebec, while most other provinces have been fairly stable. And job postings averaged 36.6 thousand, down by about 3%. This represents the lowest reading since 2018, though still above the pre-pandemic average. In the first quarter of 2026, construction averaged 99,000 job seekers per month. This is below the 2025 average, but above 2024 levels. As unemployment rebounded, ease of hiring improved. Labor market tightness is tracked by measuring the ratio of unemployed workers to vacant positions. That's the purple line. A lower ratio indicates a tighter market, meaning businesses face greater difficulty filling open roles. The tightness ratio has averaged above 2.5 for a while now, meaning almost 3 unemployed workers for every vacant position. Announced on the day of our last presentation, Team Canada Strong represents renewed and expanded federal apprenticeship support. At its core, the Team Canada Strong provides financial incentives aimed at encouraging young Canadians to enter trades. In addition, measures include wage support for SMEs that hire first-year apprentices, plans to modernize the Red Seal program, and increased funding for UTIP. The Canadian Armed Forces stream gives cadets and junior rangers early exposure to the trades, while primary reserves can receive fully funded apprentice pathways tied to CAF infrastructure work. The impact of the initiative will take time to materialize as implementation remains ongoing and apprenticeship takes years to complete. Finally, let's look at what is happening on the cost front. The data continues to show a clear split among master format divisions. Divisions with below average inflation generally continue to cool alongside broader CPI inflation. The main inflation driver remained concentrated in divisions with a heavier exposure to steel products, including structural steel framing, metal fabrications, and plumbing. These divisions continue to trend upwards, with prices higher by approximately 10% than a year ago. Openings, being the most aluminum-intensive division, was up 5%. Thermal and moisture protection didn't show a meaningful increase from petrochemical supply disruptions yet. The risk was more visible upstream than downstream, moving from crude and diesel through natural gas liquids, petrochemicals, and then finally the construction products. Petrochemicals and related products also saw substantial price increases due to the closure of the strait, with prices roughly a quarter higher in July than a year ago. Worst of all is the price of plastic resins, rising by more than 2/3. So this points to upside pressure that hasn't materialized for contractors yet, but are risks for plumbing and other plastic-intensive categories. Plumbing was already up by 10%. And on, in terms of the split among CMAs and building types, it's largely the same as what we reported the last time, with the exception that the Atlantic CMAs are no longer among the lowest inflation increases. And turning to outlook, the Canadian survey on business conditions show that construction confidence weakened at the start of the second quarter. Sentiment fell from previous quarter and also slipped below the broader business average. The deterioration in sentiment appears to be driven primarily by cost pressures. In addition, 70% of construction businesses expected supply chain challenges to worsen, well above the 52% all industry share, with none expecting improvements. We heard your feedbacks on this chart, so the table now shows the share of businesses citing each obstacle rather than quarterly changes, which caused some confusions. Inflation remained the most commonly cited obstacle, rising by 9 percentage points and being identified by more than half of the construction businesses. Transportation costs, input costs, and insurance costs also concern more businesses than previous quarters, reflecting the channels through which geopolitical developments were affecting the sector. Labor-related concerns eased, fell out of the top 3 reported concerns. And besides costs, the second important signal from this quarter was that the rise in demand-related concerns, cited by more than 1/4 of businesses. Canada has a strong appetite to build, but timing and outcomes might be uneven among firms, depending on region, subsector, and exposure to clients. Regionally, Atlantic contractors were the most optimistic, while firms in BC and Ontario were the most pessimistic. So the 3 downside risks to take away for today are largely unchanged from our presentation last quarter. Construction is still adapting to changing trade and procurement rules as those continue to develop. It is unclear when geopolitical tensions will be behind us and the energy shock will fade. Persistent uncertainty also continue to delay investment decisions. The upside risks are fresher, although most will take time to materialize. First, Canada's nation-building project pipeline has expanded. Proposed by Alberta, the West Coast Oil Pipeline would be jointly owned by the federal and Alberta government. The project was referred to the MPO in July. Assessment and consultations are already underway. It could generate substantial demand for pipeline construction, a Port of Vancouver gateway expansion, and other civil works. Second, defense is one of the clearest growth stories in Canada currently. Much of the spending will flow into military equipment and platforms, but infrastructure component is also substantial. Defense also has a important labor dimension through Team Canada Strong. Finally, Meta has announced a $13 billion data center in Alberta to be delivered by Clark Builders and PCL, while the associated Greenlight Electricity Center represents another $4.6 billion investment to be delivered by Aecon. Collectively, the 2 projects claim to support more than 4,000 construction jobs. One reason Alberta is attracting these investments is its abundant and deeply discounted natural gas. The AI boom is making the additional gas-fired generation capacity commercially viable. Alberta's broader ambition is to attract up to $100 billion in data center investment over the next 5 years. So that concludes our presentation for today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Max. This was, as usual, a very insightful presentation. I will remind participants that we have about 15 minutes for Q&As. You are welcome to use the raise hand function or put your question in text in the chat. I will either read that or turn the mic to you to ask the question. But before we do that, I'd like to just take a minute for a quick reminder regarding CCA events that are coming up in the next couple of months. I want to highlight 2 key events. The first one is the Symposium of our Best Practices in Construction. This is taking place October 6th and 7th in person in Toronto. This is really a unique opportunity for both contractors and owners to come together and learn from one another. This is the 2nd year we're doing the BPS Symposium. Last year was a massive success, and I would like to invite you all to consider registering or sending some of your emerging leaders, project manager, operation leader, etc. The second one for the CCA members and the associated COUs, our November meetings and Hill Day will take place in November 16, 17, and 18 in Ottawa. Registration is also open, but space is very limited. So if you are planning to join us in Ottawa in November, please have a look at the registration email that was sent last week. My colleague Nicole will share in chat the link to the BPS Symposium, and for Hill Day, please look at your email. Last but not least, I do want to mention that there are great sponsorship opportunities for both events. If your company want to put their brand attached to the BPS Symposium or Hill Day, my colleague Nicole, whose email will be in chat as well, is the best person to talk to. We have great visibility for you. That's the pitch. Now I'll turn to question. Anybody have hand raised? I don't see any. Feel free to put your question in chat or use the hand raise function. I see Mike Carter on camera. I'm going to guess you have a question.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand.
That's fine.
So Max, question on Buy Canada, Buy Ontario. Is there any evidence that actually either one of these are in play and are working? My understanding in Ontario, when we met with the government, is here was their succinct response to us. It is in force, but it is not being enforced, which meant to me it was a free-for-all on what possibly could be going on. And I don't know that much about whether the Fed program is in play, but I don't know if you guys seen any evidence that either one of them are in play and working.
Yeah, I think the Buy Ontario framework is definitely less concrete, and it's sort of like it's very complicated, but a bit poorly put together. I don't know if that was by design or otherwise, but as we mentioned in the presentation, if the owner chooses the commitment approach, they might just set like a arbitrarily low number for vendors to target a certain like share of Ontario or like Canadian content, and then just proceed with their regular processes. So Buy Ontario also has like less enforcement than the Buy Canadian. Buy Canadian, on the other hand, we didn't go into how like the rules would work this time because those didn't really change much from the last time when they were announced, and then when we analyzed what the restrictions are. But the PSPC is certainly still taking steps towards being able to actually implement it. They're creating online tools, even though, you know, like you said, on paper, these should be like biting on the procurement front already. But they don't have, I don't think they have the tools and system to enforce them yet. But Buy Canadian, I think will be more substantial than Buy Ontario. But that's, you know, that conclusion could only be reached after analysis.
I'll just add to that, Max, especially on the Buy Canadian. I'm not all that familiar with Ontario. Buy Canadian is very much in force and enforced. The first example of Buy Canadian was actually outside the policy. It's something that the project owner did voluntarily because they were not captured by the policy. It was a center block project, which decided retroactively to say, yeah, we will abide by this policy even though we were in procurement before the deadline. So that was the first one that actually enforced it on the contract, and it was especially noticeable for steel beam that were coming from the United States, and the engineering had to rethink how they would use Canadian material to fix the problem in another way. The two things to keep in mind with Buy Canadian that are becoming problem now is not so much in the original enforcement of the policy. I remind you that Buy Canadian policy was meant to be a PSPC policy for federal project, right? So if PSPC was to procure a lab, a office building for the procurement, national defense base, that was the idea. That changed somewhere in early 2026, not overly publicly, but within discussion internally, they said, hey, we really want to apply this policy to grants and contribution and transfer as well. And that came as a surprise to many provinces as the government announced the transfer fund for the Build Community Strong Fund, the BCSF, that have now been announced in many provinces, Ontario, Quebec, BC, where provinces are told, hey, we're going to send you $6 billion for your housing infrastructure if you cut development charges. However, you do need to apply the Buy Canadian policy, meaning you cannot source product outside Canada. This has been a challenge in some negotiation because depending on where you are in Canada, sourcing Canadian steel or Canadian product can significantly increase the price of your project. This was most notably a challenge for BC, who came to an agreement with Ottawa. The second layer of challenge is what Max has on screen here. June 1st, the main change that took place is a lowering of the threshold. In early discussion between CC and PSPC, we convinced the government to keep the threshold Buy Canadian at the same level as other compliance, most notably the child labor and forced labor and procurement. So it triggers all the compliance at once instead of having large overhead for a small project. June 1st, the request of the government, of the political side of government, they lowered the threshold to 5 million, capturing basically every project that PSPC could ever procure. So we now have a much broader scope, both in terms of dollar value, but also in terms of reach beyond PSPC project. And this is where it might become challenging for any organization that seek federal funding, for example. Thank you, Mike, for the question. Anybody else has a question about current federal policy, the economic report, or the state of the industry? We have 7 more minutes. Mike, go again.
So Max, I'm trying to visualize the unemployment human resource slides. Did I recently read that construction unemployment is now back under 5%? And I'm guessing, I haven't seen the composition of that makeup, that a single home res still seems to be in the dumper. And I'm guessing it's being picked up on the ICI side. And then I guess related to what CCA policy may be, in our Build Canada Strong submission, I sort of focused in on the fact the construction employment issue going forward to Nation Build is not about painters or drywallers. It's about 6 hardcore near industrial sort of construction trades, right? Ironworker being a poster child, boilermaker being another one, and that the solution is a very specifically tailored taking better control of those trades by the federal government to make sure that these strategies are put in place to advantage Canadian workers, not temporary foreign workers that come over and work in camps. What is more detail on what's going on with the unemployment rate for construction? Because I found that a bit surprising given how weak residential is supposedly, at least in Ontario.
I would still just recommend, because like labor data comes in monthly, and there are some months like when these numbers are improving, nobody really pays attention to them, and some months is when they drop by a few percent. Either it's a statistical thing or seasonality thing. We receive questions, but then usually, sometimes the following month that will change again. And Canada currently, right, is during a transition period where the population is declining, number of temporary workers is declining, and because the unemployment data is self-reported, so it's definitely acting more volatile than previously. I would say for some of the more recent stuff, we cover this quarterly, and that's the reason we cover it quarterly. And perhaps I could give you a better answer in the next report.
Thank you, Max. With that great thought, I think we'll wrap it up for today. We are just a few minutes shy of the half hour. So thank you, Max, again for your analysis, for the report. It is now available online. I recommend you have a look at the document, share it with your member, use it in your business. If you have any question, please feel free to reach out to Max or myself so we can provide you additional information or insight, and we will come back next quarter with the following report. Everybody, have a great day. Thank you for joining us.